So I had the line work for this Magnolia drawing just lying around unused, and I thought I'd have a go at inking it using the kind of lino cut meets tattoo style that I've had a go at before. I'm using the Pentel Brush pen to do this one, and as usual, if you've seen any of my other tutorial videos, I'm doing the same thing I always do, which is start in a very, very small space. So, you know, if I'm sort of trying to find my way with this and I make a few mistakes, it doesn't matter early on because it's only in a very small part of the drawing, and either it won't notice or I can fix it quite easily. And as you can see me doing some of the outlines of the petals here, I'm trying to, you know, get more confident with the brush pen and do more continuous kind of flowing strokes of the pen. Not always getting there, but at least I'm trying to do that. So I start with them nice and thin near the edge of the petal and then make those lines thicker towards where the petal is growing out from the center of the flower. So here you can see me doing a line that shows the kind of the middle of the petal, and that's why I really love doing flowers, is because you usually got a line that forms the very center of the petal like you would with a leaf. And you can split it into two halves then and kind of like handle one half separately to the other. And I'm making quite a tentative, very careful start here with slightly shaky hands because I haven't used the brush pen in a while, so just getting my confidence back into using it as I'm trying to do these lines that start, you know, quite long and thin and then trail down to being a little bit shorter and stubbier, trying to give that effect again, always to do, you know, with depth and the effect of light, and some lines looking thicker and some lines looking thinner. The drawing fills a 12 by 12 centimeter box, and so it's quite good for doing with the brush pen because these long strokes you can see me doing right now, where you know you're trying to keep it almost kind of a constant width from top to bottom. They're a little bit easier when you're working over a smaller area. If this was a much bigger picture, boy, these would be way more difficult to do. So I'm trying to do several things while I'm doing these petals with the brush pen. I'm trying to leave the pale parts of the petal white. And I'm also trying to do my strokes in the direction that the petal would be growing out from the center of the flower. So I'm trying to stick to those two ideas on every single petal that I ink here. So, you know, the pale bits, the highlights, I leave paper white, and the lines that I'm doing, the hatching you might call it, they suggest the kind of growth of the leaf from the center outwards. That's the plan, at least. And there are a couple of different approaches you could use to doing the strokes of the brush pen when you're doing these lines. You can see me starting with the line very, very thin and then pressing down a little bit more heavily on it as it gets closer to the area that I want it to be more shadowed. That's one way of doing it. Or you can start with the pen pressed down quite thickly, as you're going to see me working now, and then working upwards and gradually tapering, easing off the pressure on the brush pen as you go upwards, and hopefully that results in a really thick line near the bottom and then gradually getting lighter towards the top. It's not an exact science, as you can see out of the ones I've done so far. Some taper quite nicely and some are a little bit thicker than, you know, I want them to be. That's just the pressure of me putting you know, that pressure on the pen with my own hand. It's kind of difficult to make absolutely every single one uniform. I'd probably be needing to use a technical pen, like a fine liner pen, in order to try and get a bit more uniformity. But that's also one of the nice things about the brush pen. It's got that kind of expressive quality that you get from, you know, almost using a brush instead of a pen. Now here you can see me starting thin near the bottom and then pressing down thicker as I get to the center, because these petals had a bit of highlight at the top and highlight at the bottom. So that was one of the kind of puzzles, one of the problems that I was having to solve here, is how I would do that using this kind of hatching approach with the brush pen and the ink lines. So I decided to do it, as you saw, half and half. The top half I sort of flicked upwards and got lighter, and then the bottom lines you can see I just started light and then got thicker towards the inked lines I'd already done. So the kind of both sets of lines met in the middle, hopefully without any kind of drying lines, and that solved my problem of being able to show a highlight top and bottom of the petal. Another thing that made this a bit tricky as well was because I was trying to slightly angle or even gently curve some of the lines as well to suggest the shape of the petal as the petal sort of grew downwards and then curled right around on itself. And that took a bit of trial and error to try and get right, and not entirely sure I like it exactly as it turned out. Doing the stalk of where the petals attach to the actual stalk and the twig on the tree, I just used bold, basic strokes for this, nothing too fancy, because I want most of the kind of fancy looking hatch lines and the detail to be actually on the petals themselves. And then what I do with the rest of the video, which I've speeded up, is I'm just using exactly the same technique. Some of those lines are flicked downwards, some of those lines are flicked upwards, and I try and make sure that all of the lines follow the kind of growth of the leaf, the growth outwards of the leaf. I wouldn't start doing some of my hatching lines sort of left to right here, because it would totally spoil the kind of effect that I was trying to get. Doing most of the hatching on this was fairly easy to do in terms of the downwards or upward strokes of the pen. But because of where the camera is situated, I had to twist it around to do these last bits to just get the direction of the stroke, to make it a little bit more easy for me to actually make those strokes go outwards or upwards and curve around. It also allows me to see some little bits and pieces where I think now the lines are too thin. Now I've done most of it and I need to thicken some up. Here I wasn't pleased with those bits that I've just pointed out there. Those lines seem to be angled too far diagonally towards the right. So at this point I went back in with the brush pen and I tried to kind of drag them down, make some of them kind of come together a bit more so they were slightly thicker and also angled slightly more curving upwards rather than diagonally up towards kind of, you know, the way that they were pointing before, kind of like a northeast kind of direction. Try to sort that out. So that's what it looked like when it was completely inked, and I just felt, can I leave it, you know, just black on white like that? I wasn't totally confident that I could, so I decided to give it a background. And for this I tested out, you can see on the right hand side, I tested a bit of Quink ink watered down, and in the center there a bit of Payne's Grey watercolor. And I decided to go with the Payne's Grey watercolor as a kind of dark to light, very, very simple background effect, you know, just a little bit of a painted effect in the background, because often I don't do backgrounds. I tend to just do a picture and it's kind of hanging there, floating there in space. So I thought, no, you know, I ought to do a background for this one. So the Payne's Grey watercolor also gave me just a little bit more time to work the paint without it staining the paper so quickly. The Quink ink did tend to leave drying lines super quick, even if I was dipping that brush in the water straight away and getting it right back on the paper. And there are two things happening. When you see me take the brush away, I'm either putting more water on it to flood the colour around, move it around and lighten it up a little bit, or I'm wiping the brush completely dry on a piece of tissue paper, so when I come and bring it back on and I move it around, it's you know, slowly blending some of that paint or lifting a bit of it off and making it light to dark in that way. So there you go, there's the finished picture. Let me know what you think of it in the comments below, and if any of the tips and techniques that I've discussed today are helpful to you. And if you haven't already seen the colour version of this Magnolia drawn with Winsor & Newton pigment markers, then check the links below, and there are two videos there that you can watch, a speeded up one and a tutorial to do with the white blender.